Welcome to an edition of CCSD Living Environment. Today we're going to start talking about genetics and what happens when traits are passed from parents to offspring. To start off, let's talk about heredity. Heredity is the passage of characteristics from parent to offspring. And so that takes us to genetics, which you've heard the word many times. Genetics is the scientific study of heredity. So this is one of the cases where it's a study of, but it doesn't end in ology. If we're going to talk about genetics, we have to talk about Gregor Mendel. When we talk about Gregor Mendel, he's usually referred to as the father of modern genetics. He used pea plants to study the pattern of inheritance. How are traits passed from parent to offspring? And that's what Mendel looked at. So the question becomes, why did he use peas? Well, Mendel was an Austrian monk, and his job in the monastery was to work in the garden. And so there were lots of peas there, and he just decided to use the peas. But why were they a good thing for him to use? For one thing, they can self-pollinate, which we'll talk about in just a minute. They grow very easily, they mature quickly, and they produce a large number of offspring. So that was a great group of characteristics for him to use pea plants. Humans don't make a great thing to use when we're trying to study genetics or heredity because we don't self-pollinate, and we don't mature very quickly, and by that I mean we don't go from young to adult quickly, and we don't produce a large number of offspring. Now, there are a lot of people in the world, but that's not because one individual plant or one small group produced a large amount. It's because there's a large population, and everybody's adding to the total number. So what is a trait? We throw that word around a lot. What does a trait mean? It is a specific characteristic of an individual. So if we're going to talk about those peas, the pea color, whether it's green or yellow, or the plant height, is it tall or short? Maybe we're going to talk about the pod. What does the seed look like? Is it round or is it wrinkly? And if you've ever had a bag of peas before, you've seen those characteristics. So the pea plants will actually self-pollinate. So what that means is that inside the flower of the pea plant, the sperm and the egg from one flower will come together to create the offspring. So that's what they mean when they tell you a plant will self-pollinate, is that it uses the sperm and the egg from the same flower to do that. So the plant that is produced has all of the characteristics from one parent because the sperm and the egg came from that one original flower. So we say that those are true breeding or self-pollinating plants, and we call them purebred. That's what we mean when we refer to something as purebred. So then what Mendel did is he took and he crossed the two purebred plants. So if I had a tall plant, I'm going to let them self-pollinate, and then if I have a short plant, I'm going to let them self-pollinate. So I have a purebred tall and a purebred short. That's what he did. So there were 7 different characteristics of pea plants that he used. The traits have contrasting characteristics, like tall and short, or purple and white, yellow and green, round and wrinkled. In each case, there's a contrasting thing. They're not very close together. There's a definite difference between them. And because they're contrasting like that, it was easy for Mendel to notice one characteristic versus the other. The offspring produced from the parents with different traits are called hybrids. And this is a word that we hear all the time, especially now with vehicles. What does it mean to have a hybrid car? It means that it can run on battery, but it can run on gas. So it kind of can do both. So if I have a purebred tall and I have a purebred short and I mate them together, what do I end up with? Well, the tall parent is going to give a tall, the short parent is going to give a short. So in my new offspring, I have one tall, one short. Since I have one of both, we call that the hybrid individual. So how did Mendel go about actually mating these pea plants? Well, we know they normally self-pollinate. So what he did was he removed the male parts of the flower, and he took the pollen from, say, the tall one, and he sprinkled it on the short plant. So what happened was the tall pollen fertilized the short eggs, and that gave us the next generation of offspring. So Mendel forced that to happen. They wouldn't have done that on their own. So there's a couple things we need to look at when we do genetic crosses. The first one, we need to talk about what does it mean for the parent generation. The parent generation is the original pair of plants, so my tall and my short. So when they mate, that gives us what they call the first filial generation, or the F1. Those are the offspring of the parents. And then we'd have the second filial generation, which is the offspring of the F1. So for example, if your grandparents were the parent generation, your parents would be the F1, you would be the F2, your children would be the F3. Let's go to your great-grandparents. If your great-grandparents were the parent generation, your grandparents would be the F1, your parents would be the F2, you would be the F3. So you can set the parent generation anywhere you want to, and then everything else just follows in line from there. So what Mendel found was that the hybrid offspring had the characteristics of only one of the parents. So again, let's go back. What did he do? He took that purebred tall and the purebred short, and then he cross-pollinated. He made them mate with each other. All of the offspring that he got, all of the F1 that he got, all had tall characteristic. They were all expressing only one of the characteristics. So he drew two conclusions from that. The first one being an individual's characteristics are determined by factors. We now refer to those factors as genes. And the different types of genes are called alleles. So way back when Mendel did this, which was in the kind of mid-1800s, genes weren't known at that point. So he called them factors. There's a factor that's affecting what characteristics each organism gets. Okay. Now we call those factors genes. Well, we know that we get one copy of a gene from our mom, and we get one copy of a gene from our dad. So if we get one from mom and we get one from dad, then that's telling me that I have two copies. They could be the same, both tall, both short, or they could be different, one tall, one short. So those differences we call alleles, and that's where that term allele comes from. It's the options that you have for a gene. So the other conclusion that Mendel drew is what he calls the principle of dominance. Sometimes you'll see that the law of dominance. It says that some alleles are dominant, some alleles are recessive. If an organism has at least one dominant allele, they will express that form of the trait, which is why when we had tall and short, all of the offspring had the tall allele, which means that every offspring in the F1 generation was showing tall. The only way the recessive is expressed is if the dominant trait is not there. So remember, purebred tall, purebred short, when I mated them, they all ended up tall. Well, what happened to the short? It didn't disappear. Mendel let the F1 plant self-pollinate now. In the F2, the traits controlled by the recessive allele reappeared. About a quarter of the offspring actually show the recessive allele. So about 1/4 of the total number of offspring are actually showing me that short characteristic now. That's what he found after he let the F1 plants then self-pollinate with each other. Mendel thought the dominant allele masked the recessive allele or covered it up in the F1. But in the F2, it came back, indicating that the recessive allele has actually separated from the dominant allele. So at some point along the way, where dominant and recessive were together, now they've actually moved away from each other. They've actually separated from each other. So when, where, or how could that possibly have happened? So we're talking about the separation of the dominant and recessive alleles. The other word that you should connect to that is segregation. Segregation and separation mean the same thing, and you'll see it written as separation also. So where did that happen? Mendel thought that the two of them had to move away from each other during the formation of gametes. Remember, gametes are sex cells, like the sperm and the egg. So in the production of the gamete, inside the mom or the dad, in the production of the gamete, where you had two, I had the one from my mom and the one from my dad, I only pass one of those on to my offspring, which means that they have to move away from each other so that in the eggs that I'm going to give, they only have one allele to pass on. So during gamete formation, the alleles for each trait segregate or separate from each other so that each gamete carries only one allele for a gene. So when you pass it on as the male or female parent, you're only passing on one copy of that trait to the next generation. Okay, so what does that look like? So here's the way that we represent it, and this is what you've seen before when you've talked about genetics in the past. You know that we talk about the different letters. So we know in the F1 generation I had a hybrid individual. Hybrid meaning that my big letter and my little letter are not the same. I have big T and I have little t. They're not the same. This would be a tall individual. Gamete formation means they're going to separate from each other. So the big T and the little t are going to separate. So if this is mom and this is dad, they're going to separate. And again, that formation of gametes we call segregation. Okay? So at that point, what happens? Well, if fertilization is going to take place, where the sperm and the egg are going to come together, one is going to come from here, one would come from here. What would that be representing? Tall. One comes from here, one comes from here. Again, since one of them is there, if dominant's there, dominance expressed. One comes from here, one comes from here. Again, if dominant is there, dominance expressed. And then look what happens in that F2 generation. If this one and this one come together, this is going to give me the short characteristic, which means that in that F2 generation, some of my recessive genes, some of my recessive traits come back out. So when we talk about that, I know that big T, and little t, they're the same. So what's happening? I'm taking the sperm and the egg and they're coming together at fertilization. When that happens, if my sperm had big T and my egg had big T, they're giving me the same allele in my zygote. Remember, a fertilized egg is called a zygote. So when they're the same, what prefix meant same? Homo. When I get the same thing in the zygote, we call it homozygous. If they happen to be for the dominant allele, we're going to call it homozygous dominant. If it's for the recessive allele, we're going to call it homozygous recessive. So what about on the other one? Well, big T and little t are different. They're not exactly the same. So what are we going to call those? Hetero means different. Again, they're different in the zygote, so it's heterozygous. Or the other name for heterozygous is hybrid. Like we said, they're not the same. So that gives you a couple different terms that you have to make sure that you have an understanding of. We have homozygous and we have heterozygous. And if it's a capital letter, it's going to give me homozygous dominant. If it's a lowercase letter, it's going to give me homozygous recessive. And if the two of them are not the same, that's what we consider to be the heterozygous condition. So this was what Mendel had worked out and determined that, okay, these guys must have come away from each other to form these sex cells, to form the gametes, so that when they come back together, you only end up with one copy from each parent. You only get one allele from each parent. So in this new offspring, in this new individual, I have one copy from my mom and one copy from my dad. So how does that work? What are the chances of something working like that? And that's where we're going to talk about probability. So probability, remember from math class, is the likelihood a particular event will occur. That's what probability means. So past outcomes do not affect future ones. If you flip a coin, you have a 50-50 chance it's going to land heads up. So 1 out of 2, it's going to land heads up. What if I wanted to know, okay, if you flip it 3 times in a row, what are the chances that it's going to end up heads up 3 times in a row? So what are you going to do? Well, if past outcomes don't affect future outcomes, then you're going to have 1/2 times 1/2 times 1/2. So what are the chances that 3 times in a row that penny is going to land heads up? And when you do the math, it comes out to be 1/8. And we do very similar math when it comes to genetics. There's a probability. What are the chances that that pea plant is going to pass on the short characteristic? Well, there were 4 options that it just showed you for possibilities when the gametes came together. 1 out of 4 would give you the recessive characteristic. Every organism has a genetic makeup along with a set of observable characteristics. Your genetic makeup is what's inside. It's your genes. I can't see that. What you express, the traits that you show, I can see. Those are the characteristics like eye color, hair color, height in a pea plant, seed color, flower color. So there's 2 terms that we have to define here. The first one being phenotype, the physical trait, that's what you see. The pea color, the plant height, the seed color, your eye color, your hair color. That's your phenotype, that's the physical trait. The other one is your genotype. The genotype is the genetic makeup, like for example, big T, little t, or little t, little t. So what would be the other way that I could say big T, little t? Heterozygous. What's the other way I could say little t, little t? Homozygous recessive. So the phenotype is what you would see, purple, white, brown, red, blue, whatever it is. The genotype is your homozygous dominant, heterozygous, or homozygous recessive. Remember, the genotype is what's inherited. We got these from our parents. The phenotype is determined by the genotype. Depending on which of those characteristics you got, you express maybe the recessive allele, or maybe you express the dominant allele. Just because you express the dominant allele, it may not tell you if you're heterozygous or homozygous dominant. Because remember, the law of dominance said, as long as dominant is there, dominant would be expressed. That takes us through an introduction to the beginnings of genetics. What we're going to do next time is start looking at how to do some of the probabilities and how do we actually look at some of these genotypes and phenotypes. How do we distinguish genotype from phenotype? And what is it that you actually write down? So that takes us through our video for today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.